Good morning, everybody. I've got a number of slides which I'm going to rattle through because I've got a little group exercise for you, which, for those of you in the audience that know that I'm not terribly good with iPads, you're going to play with pens and pencils and paper, and it'll be a bit like Blue Peter, probably. That's, I clearly haven't learnt to do anything more than that. What I want to do, really, in the next few slides is just to literally go through a little bit about the commissioning landscape, some of the programmes of work that we've got underway, and just to share with you some of what we think is likely to be happening with commissioning of a whole range of services come 2013. Very much this year is being seen as a transition year, and there's an awful lot of work and different pieces of work going on around providing advice, particularly into the NHS Commissioning Board, who, when they were first told they were likely to be having to contract with in excess of 167 trusts for chemotherapy, started to get a little bit worried. So you can imagine that there's quite a range of work to do. I'm not going to rehearse much of the slides around commissioning structure because you'll all be familiar with it, but safe to say that the Commissioning Board comes into being in 2013, supported by clinical commissioning groups, commissioning support services, and clinical networks, and health and wellbeing boards. Over the course of the summer and autumn last year, one of the pre-groups starting to look at what the Commissioning Board might be looking at asked Mike in particular what he thought should be commissioned in terms of cancer services around the Commissioning Board itself. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of them, but every time I produce a set of slides, the goalposts change a little bit and things move, and I think that's just a symptom of how things are sort of changing and are quite fluid. At national level, though, one of the key things that is likely to remain being commissioned at national level will be the screening programmes. And specialised commissioning groups may well still continue to tackle services around rarer cancers and radiotherapy. Clinical commissioning groups will very definitely across Cancer be commissioning common cancers, and at the moment I've put possibly some chemotherapy. There is no complete definition or agreement as to where chemotherapy will sit outside the Cancer Drug Fund, which will remain at SHA or regional level. And I think really important that this whole infrastructure is supported by clinical networks, of which cancer remain part of that. Just want to turn a little bit to some key programmes of work across both NCAT and the NCIN. I am truly not going to go through these key programmes in detail, but safe to say that we do cover the whole spectrum of the pathway from NADI right through to end-of-life care, and you'll know this afternoon is covers most of the end-of-life care programmes. So there's a very full active programme for NCAT. For those of you that don't know, there is an NCAT website, and that's just a screenshot from the front page, but many of the publications and documents that have been produced, you'll find some of them set out at the back of the room here today. Just very quickly, some core messages, if you like, around what the NCIN is trying to do around promoting efficient and effective data collection throughout the cancer journey, providing a common national repository for cancer data sets, and some of you will know that there are a number of new ones going through this year, and particularly dear to my heart is, for the first time, is some capture of data around chemotherapy. And I should say that we started this collection at the beginning of April, mandated, and we've had 18 files already returned. So we're beginning to get the very first early outputs of something around activity around chemotherapy. But it is one of the few areas that we simply have very little data in England. Clearly the NCIN also produce expert analyses to monitor patterns of cancer care, and to all intents exploit information to drive improvements in cancer care and clinical outcomes. And again, for those of you not familiar, there's their screenshot from the front page of their website. Now, in terms of what's already happening, the Improving Outcomes and Strategy for Cancer, when it was launched in last year, very definitely said that NCAT and NCIN would be developing a commissioning support pack. And you're going to hear a number of presentations later and a demonstration of the toolkit of two of those in particular, where we've made quite big inroads over the last few years, Cancer Commissioning Toolkit and its sister publication, Cancer Commissioning Guidance. It will not be something that you find at the back of the room, because those of you that have seen it, it's about 160 odd pages long. It's not a small little tome, but when you appreciate it does take you through the whole pathway, it is quite a detailed document. Part of the commissioning pack, though, will include some of the key messages that you heard Ruth give. It'll also have a little bit about user involvement in cancer commissioning, and it will have some detail on service specifications, and I'll come back to those shortly, and service profiles, which you're going to hear from Andy. One of the other things that you wanted to make you aware of is that particularly in this transition year, where quite a lot of services may or may not be going to the commissioning board, we've been asked to support quite a lot of work from the Specialised Commissioning Transition Group. And there is what is known as a Cancer Clinical Reference Group. I think my whole of my summer is going to be geared to writing in excess of 16 documents around service specifications for particularly the more rarer cancers, and I've already had contributions from particularly the NCIN tumour groups and the network teams that sit as part of those. What's already around and available to help support you, the Cancer Commissioning Toolkit, GP profiles, which the NCN have done a lot of work around, and Di will pick that up a bit later, and again, PCT profiles. Some of you, I'm sure, will already be familiar the two pieces of work that were given out to MDTs last year, which is very detailed service profiles for the MDTs, both for breast and colorectal services, and it's very much being seen as the start of a series of work. Again, last year and the early part of this year, working very closely with Mike and Cancer Networks, really trying to get a flavour from all of you around what some of your needs would be, and hence the early key messaging documents that came out. I think absolutely crystal clear here is the need for more timely data, and so there's a huge piece of work around modernising cancer registries, and again just a piece of work really around, particularly around routes to diagnosis and picking up key things around emergency presentations. At the back of the room you will find a number of the guidance documents that we've brought out. The Cancer Commissioning guidance, as I say, is available on the website. And one of the things that we do spend some time doing, particularly working with Royal Colleges, and one of the things that came out earlier this year, and it's, if you like, an addendum to some of the nice documents around improving outcomes guidance. We've just brought out a best practice guide for developing hematological diagnostic services. Again, just something that, because networks and commissioning teams were struggling to get this element of the hematology IO produced, just a sort of additional piece of information to help. But again, these were just sort of random pieces of documents that have come out. So a piece of work around rehab care, characteristics, good characteristics of an MDT, and you heard Ruth mention a little bit about acute oncology. And it's the first of a series of documents really just to help those that are not quite as advanced really, with some handy hints of other networks who have started to get to grips with what acute oncology might look like. We're very fortunate in cancer, despite the Marmite analogy really around cancer peer review. But in fact, there is a quality assurance system in cancer, and not many services have this. It's well tried and tested with all the caveats that Ruth gave. I guess if you were to take cancer peer review here in the middle, and the three main areas of work now around supporting the NHS Commissioning Board, supporting new clinical commissioning groups, and then with a focus to the Care Quality Commission. And I guess with some real three planks of work really around making sure that patient safety is really at the heart of everything that we do, and the peer review measures contained in the measures really do map onto the CQC standards and quality statements. Down here, really supporting specifications of trust contracts and providing a real purchaser focus and support the work of clinical commissioning groups, again using the measures to support that. And then lastly, working really, really closely with clinical teams around making sure there is a clinical focus and highlighting the measures. And I, having been around and having seen peer review from its very beginning when it was first originally started by regional teams, it is a very unique source of information. It's validated information on individual clinical teams, which enables informed choice. provides nationally benchmarked data. It identifies and helps the resolution of immediate risks to patients and all staff, and it has been a significant catalyst for change in teams in many organisations for many different types. And I think it does enable a huge amount of rapid learning, sharing of learning between clinical teams. I want to just turn the next couple of slides really to this huge piece of work, and this is a horribly complicated slide, but I'm actually not going to take you anywhere apart from the very bottom really, which is really around trying to do some work particularly around the more specialist services. And it became clear over the course of the summer last year, and this is not just around cancer care, but there are a huge number of services that are being commissioned for which there is no service specification or documentation written about. So whether you're talking about cleft and lip palate, though that's probably not a terribly good example, particularly as they have got a service specification, but some real issues across the whole bit of where services don't have any documentation. For those of you that don't know, anything defined as specialist is usually around services that are done on behalf of a population of in excess of 1 million. So things for us might be anal cancers, liver resection, so it's not the more common cancers. So a huge piece of work is just about to start to help support these reference groups. Now what we are likely to be doing is developing some service scopes, making best use of policies, and I think it's very difficult sometimes. People just don't quite know where there's some signposting around what material is in use, and particularly for cancer. There are already a huge wealth of standards, and particularly some of the standards, albeit some of them may be quite old, contained in the Improving Outcomes series of documents. So all of that will be being brought together and also gives us a chance to review current sequins that may exist, and also existing schemes within QIP. So there is a huge piece of work that's going to go on between now and the very end of the summer. There are 5 main programs of care, and it's not difficult to see that even though cancer has its own little heading over here, that cancer does pretty well sit in all of the other 5 main programs of care. And some of you in the room may know that Sean Duffy, the network director up in Leeds, is actually the chair of this particular clinical reference group. But cancer clearly does sit down here in terms of children and young people's cancer, and also head and neck. So I think part of the challenge for us with all these other additional groups is to make sure that the group looking at head and neck does know that there is a cancer element of it that will probably be generated out of this group. So a huge piece of work around these areas. I just wanted to talk a little bit about radiotherapy and chemotherapy. I said at the very beginning that there's just still some question marks around who may be commissioning what from April. But at the moment, radiotherapy is being seen as being part of the minimum take. It is likely to be being commissioned by the commissioning board in the future, but again, it does have a question mark in it. There they have a clinical reference group, and at the moment they have already produced a standard of care, which I will show you. They have already produced a generic specification and a commissioning dashboard. Service profiles for radiotherapy are available on the Cancer Commissioning Toolkit, and importantly for this service, they now have a non-mandated tariff that has been published. I mentioned that they had got a standard of care, and I think working very closely with network colleagues, that the aspiration is to make sure there is access to modern radiotherapy techniques, particularly IMRT, so intensity modulated radiotherapy and image guided radiotherapy. And services not able to offer this are expected to have plans in place so that this becomes a routine piece of treatment over the next 12 months. So I think a huge piece of work being undertaken by radiotherapy departments now. Just if I had to give you a mirror image for chemotherapy, I'm certainly all of us are slightly nervous at the moment around really lack of clarity around who is going to be picking up elements around chemotherapy. I should say that both chemotherapy and radiotherapy have a national implementation group. When the main national group, co-chaired by Mike and the senior clinician, were disbanded from being an advisory group, they all took on the life and an implementation group. And so we're currently underway with producing a standard of care and again a generic specification and some key performance indicators for that. I should say the one thing about chemotherapy is that some of you may already know that in the Any Qualified Provider agenda last year, one of the groups or clinical treatments that was in there was around developing community chemotherapy. We will be developing what's known as an information pack for community chemotherapy as part of the Any Qualified Provider agenda, and that should be available from the autumn. At least hopefully it will be. Now I just wanted you all to do a little bit of thinking around, it's all very well for all of us to sort of sit here saying, well, we think this is what's likely to happen, but all of you will have views around what different services you think you ought to be commissioning. And one of the pieces of work that NCAT has done is to work very closely with Map of Medicine and to produce a whole heap of clinical pathways. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that we're all going to go off and commission by using clinical pathways, but what I just wanted you to do is just to have a little bit of thinking on your table, and I've got 6 sheets of paper that are about to come round to you with some different coloured pens. There is a fair amount of detail, and the 6 pages that you're going to get each cover one of these individual blocks, and against it you will then see a very detailed split of a pathway. And using some colour crayons, and I'll give you the colour code in a minute, I just want you all to have a thought around what do you think you want to commission. So it's not about what do you commission now, it's which groups are likely to be commissioning services. So that's whether it's CCGs, whether it's specialist commissioning, or indeed the National Commissioning Board, or anybody else that you think might be commissioning services. That is the pen colour code, and you'll all be getting different coloured pens on your table and 6 charts. Now, there are probably enough of you on the table to either have a go at one each, but 10 minutes, we tried this in London, and 10 minutes is ample, just to do a quick bit in graffiti with pens all over, just to try and get a flavour for where and who you think will have responsibility for commissioning parts of the pathway. And I think absolutely one of the key challenges for all of us is to make sure that wherever and whoever does that commissioning, that some of that commissioning really is joined up, because I think there's a real issue that bits may slip through different sort of elements. So over to you for the next 5-10 minutes, but happy for you to tell me that you've finished doing it. So please graffiti over all those charts, and I'll be back in a few minutes. Can I just take a view? I've assumed you're all quite close to finishing. I've seen some graffiti and lots of graffiti, and then others not with so many, but I'm happy to call it an end. And what I will try and do is feed back to you on the 6 before we close at lunch. I guess just for all of us, the challenge will be that I suspect many of you in the room may well be commissioning different parts of this pathway. Indeed, I know that particularly in London, they are looking at commissioning across a whole pathway. So I think we're going to see some very different structures around. So I think, you know, the new commissioning landscape really is in development in more ways than one. Services very definitely will be commissioned at different level, and some still to be determined. Council networks, clinical networks, and their clinical tumour groups will have a huge role to play in shaping where we go. Working very closely at the moment with the NCIN tumour groups, and finally to say that we all have a role in this new direction of travel. So that was just a very quick counter through, and what I'm going to do is hand over to Andy McMeekin now, who's going to take you through some of the service specification, some of the service profiles.